Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The Geiger counter on my hip wasn't just clicking anymore. It was screaming. A frantic, rhythmic static that synced perfectly with the pounding of my heart against my ribs. I froze, my boots sinking slightly into the irradiated mud, and killed the audio on the device. Silence didn't return. The forest around me was alive, but not with the sounds of birds or wind. It was a low, guttural shuffling. Somewhere to my left, beyond a rusted chain-link fence that had collapsed under the weight of 30 years of neglect, a twig snapped. It wasn't the wind. The air here didn't smell like pine or rain. It smelled of ozone, copper, and something sweet, like rotting meat left out in the sun. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, feeling the cold steel bite into my glove. My breath fogged up the visor of my gas mask, obscuring the decaying concrete structure looming ahead. This wasn't on any tourist map of Pripyat. This wasn't the amusement park or the reactor. This was the dark spot on the satellite imagery that the government claimed didn't exist. I checked my tactical radio, clipped securely to my shoulder, ensuring the volume was zeroed out. I couldn't risk a squelch giving away my position. The shuffling grew louder. It wasn't one of them. It was a pack. I lowered my center of gravity, moving with practiced silence toward the breach in the facility's perimeter wall. The concrete was stained with black mold and scorch marks. Above the heavy steel doors, a faded sign in Cyrillic hinted at the horrors inside. Biological Research Station 7. A hospital. But not for healing. As I slipped through the broken doors, the light from the outside world died, replaced by the suffocating darkness of the tomb. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted light, the beam cutting through the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The lobby was a graveyard of overturned gurneys and shattered glass. But it was the floor that made me stop. It was covered in a thick, dried substance that crunched under my boots. Not rust. Blood. Gallons of it. And leading away from the carnage, dragging footprints that went deeper into the facility. I wasn't just exploring a ruin. I was entering a hunting ground. My mission was simple. Retrieve the sample and get out. But as the moan of a creature echoed down the elevator shaft, vibrating through the floor and into the soles of my feet, I knew simple was off the table. I gripped my weapon tighter, the polymer furniture feeling like the only anchor to reality I had left. I took a step forward, the sound of broken glass under my boot echoing like a gunshot. Then, from the darkness of the corridor ahead, the shuffling stopped. A pair of milky, reflective eyes caught the beam of my light. It snarled, a wet, tearing sound. I raised my rifle. This was it. Welcome to the Exclusion Zone. The air inside the corridor was colder than the outside, a bone-deep chill that bypassed my thermal layers. I moved slowly, checking corners. The walls were lined with observation windows, most of them shattered outward, as if whatever was inside had desperately wanted out. I approached the first intact window. The glass was thick, reinforced with wire mesh. I wiped a layer of grime away with my glove. Inside, the room was preserved in a terrifying tableau. Surgical tools were scattered across the floor, but the operating table was the focal point. Leather straps, thick and heavy, had been snapped like thread. There were scratch marks deep in the metal of the table, gouges that no human fingernail could make. I moved on, my senses dialed up to 11. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every drip of condensation sounded like a footstep. I found a stairwell, the door hanging off its top hinge. The sign pointed down, Sublevel 2 cryogenics and containment. That's where the intel said the sample would be. I pushed the door open, the metal groaning in protest. The stairwell was narrow, the concrete steps slick with moisture. As I descended, the smell changed. The metallic tang of blood faded, replaced by a chemical sharpness. Formaldehyde and bleach, masking the underlying scent of decay. I reached the landing of Sublevel 2. The heavy blast door was slightly ajar. I squeezed through, my tactical vest catching on the frame. I pulled free, stumbling slightly into the room beyond. It was a lab. A massive, sprawling space filled with rows of glass tanks. Most were empty, shattered. But the ones in the back, they were still intact. A faint green emergency light pulsed from a backup generator somewhere deep in the complex, casting long, dancing shadows. I approached the nearest tank. Floating in the murky yellow liquid was a figure. Humanoid, but wrong. The limbs were elongated, the jaw unhinged, rows of serrated teeth visible even through the glass. Tubes connected to its chest and skull. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. This wasn't radiation mutation. This was engineered. I pulled the dossier from my pouch, comparing the photo to the thing in the tank. It was a match. Project 7 Alpha. The bioweapon that was supposed to have been destroyed in the 90s. It wasn't destroyed. It was waiting. A crash from the other side of the lab made me spin around, rifle up. A tray of instruments had fallen to the floor. I wasn't alone. I scanned the room, the green light playing tricks on my eyes. Then I saw it. Crouched behind an overturned desk, watching me. It wasn't in a tank. It was out. And it looked hungry. The airlock wheel was cold enough to burn through my gloves, a circle of rusted iron that hadn't moved since the reactor went critical in '86. Or so the history books said. The scratches around the keyhole told a different story. Fresh gouges in the metal, bright and silver against the dull oxblood paint. Someone had tried to get in, or perhaps, someone had tried desperately to keep something out. I checked the seal on my mask, the rubber biting into my jawline, and adjusted the strap of my AK-74. The Geiger counter clipped to my chest chirped a steady, rhythmic warning, hovering just below the red zone. This was it. The ghost facility. The rumor that had cost 3 of my best runners their lives just to locate. Coordinates scrawled on the back of a dead scientist's photograph found in a Pripyat basement. They called it Object 44 Delta. A bioweapon hospital hidden beneath the shell of a generic Soviet sanitarium. I put my weight into the wheel. It screamed, a metal-on-metal shriek that echoed through the dead forests behind me, but the mechanism turned. With a pneumatic hiss that smelled of stale ozone and ancient copper, the heavy door swung inward. The silence that poured out wasn't empty, it was heavy, pressurized. I stepped into the decontamination chamber, the beam of my tactical light cutting through swirling dust motes that danced like microscopic ghosts. The floor was littered with discarded hazmat suits, yellow and orange heaps that looked like shed reptile skin. I knelt by one, turning the helmet over. The visor was shattered from the inside. Dried blood, black as tar, coated the interior. Whatever man had died in this suit hadn't suffocated. He'd screamed until his lungs burst, or clawed his own eyes out. I didn't linger. The scavenging potential here was worth the nightmare fuel. High-grade antibiotics, untouched morphine, perhaps even experimental viral suppressors. In a world where a scratch from a walker meant a fever death in 48 hours, this place was a gold mine. Pushing past the secondary blast doors, I entered the reception atrium. The linoleum was pristine under a layer of gray dust, the Soviet propaganda posters on the walls peeling but legible. Health is the weapon of the people, one proclaimed, illustrated with a soldier injecting a syringe into a muscular arm. The irony was palpable. I swept the room, weapon raised. Clear. I moved toward the triage station, vaulting the counter. The drawers were locked, but a quick pry with my combat knife snapped the cheap mechanisms. Jackpot. Ampoules of adrenaline, sealed boxes of surgical tubing, and pristine scalpels. I swept them into my pack, the clinking of glass muffled by the padded lining. But it was the logbook on the desk that stopped me. It wasn't the standard medical register. It was a containment log. The dates were wrong. They went well past the 1986 evacuation. They went into the 90s. Into the 2000s. The facility hadn't been abandoned during the meltdown, it had been activated because of it. I flipped to the final entries. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. Subject 19 shows integration of the radionuclide isotopes with the viral protein shell. Mutation rate accelerating. The necrotic tissue is regenerating, not decaying. They are getting stronger in the radiation. They are evolving. I looked up, the darkness of the hallway suddenly feeling much more hostile. We treated the infection like a rot, a degradation of the host. But here, in the heart of the zone, the radiation wasn't killing the virus. It was fueling it. I needed to get to the labs on the sublevel. That's where the high-value loot would be, the prototypes, the centrifuge data, the cure if one ever existed. I found the stairwell, the heavy fire door propped open by a gurney. The descent was a journey into the belly of the beast. The air grew colder, the metallic taste in my mouth sharper. My dosimeter ticked faster, the sound like a relentless insect. Sublevel 2, Virology. The corridor was lined with observation windows looking into pressurized isolation cells. I shined my light into the first one. Empty, save for a smear of organic matter on the reinforced glass. The second one held a corpse. I approached the glass, squinting. It wasn't a normal walker. The body was bloated, but not from gas. The muscle mass had doubled, the skin stretching and tearing to accommodate the growth. Bone spurs protruded from the shoulders and elbows, jagged and calcified. It looked like the radiation had fused the skeleton into an exoskeleton. This was the evolution the logbook spoke of. Armored walkers. Just what the wasteland needed. I reached the main lab at the end of the hall. The door was blasted off its hinges, scorch marks radiating from the frame. Inside, it was a chaotic treasure trove. Centrifuges, microscopes, computer terminals that would never wake up again. I moved to the cold storage units. The generator had died decades ago, but these were vacuum-sealed thermal flasks. I cracked one open. Blue coolant mist hissed out. Inside sat a rack of vials filled with a luminescent green liquid. V77 strain inhibitor. This was it. Enough currency to buy a seat on the last extraction chopper, or to rule a settlement for a decade. I began loading the vials, my hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the wealth I was holding. Then I heard it. Not a groan. Not the shuffling drag of a rotting foot. It was a click. A wet, guttural click, like a dolphin sounding off underwater, but distorted. I froze. The sound came from the ceiling. I slowly tilted my head back, raising the light. The drop ceiling tiles were missing above the central workbench. Huddled in the crawlspace, wedged between the ventilation ducts and the conduit pipes, was something. It was humanoid, but the limbs were elongated, double-jointed. The skin was translucent, revealing a network of black veins pulsing with dark fluid. It didn't have eyes, just a smooth, pale surface where the upper face should be, and a mouth filled with needle teeth that unhinged like a snake's. It was clinging to the pipes with hands that ended in hooked talons. A stalker. A mutation born of the dark and the radiation. It dropped before I could bring the rifle to bear. It hit the floor with a wet slap and launched itself at me in the same motion. I threw myself backward, crashing into a lab bench, glass shattering around me. The creature shrieked, a sound that vibrated in my teeth, and swiped at me. The claws tore through my jacket, shredding the Kevlar weave like paper. I kicked out, my boot connecting with its chest, feeling like I'd kicked a bag of wet cement. It stumbled back, hissing. I scrambled up, bringing the AK up. I squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in strobe light horror. Bullets impacted the creature, punching holes in the pale flesh, but there was no blood, only a black, viscous sludge. It didn't fall. It flinched, absorbing the kinetic energy, and lunged again. I rolled to the side, the creature's claws gouging deep furrows into the metal table where I'd been a second before. I couldn't go toe-to-toe with this thing. It was fast, strong, and adapted to this environment. I needed an edge. My hand brushed against a canister of liquid nitrogen on the counter, part of the cooling system for the samples. I grabbed the nozzle, ripping the hose free. The creature coiled to spring, its mouth opening to unleash another sonic shriek. I aimed the hose and twisted the valve. A plume of sub-zero vapor blasted into the creature's face. It thrashed, the liquid nitrogen freezing the moisture on its skin instantly. The black sludge in its veins began to crystallize. It slowed, its movements becoming jerky and brittle. I didn't wait for it to thaw. I switched to full auto and unloaded the rest of the magazine into its center of mass. The frozen flesh shattered, chunks of ice and gore exploding outward. The creature collapsed, a pile of broken limbs and black ice. I stood there, panting, the silence rushing back into the room, heavier than before. My heart hammered against my ribs. I checked the vials in my pack. Unbroken. I reloaded, my fingers fumbling with the magazine. The encounter had confirmed my worst fears. The infection wasn't just persisting, it was optimizing. The zone was a petri dish, and we were the control group. I moved to the exit, stepping over the shattering remains of the Stalker. I had to get this intel back to the Enclave. They had to know that the walls wouldn't hold. Not against this. As I climbed the stairs, the Geiger counter spiked again, harder this time. I looked down at my arm where the creature had slashed me. The blood oozing from the wound was dark, darker than it should be. And for a second, just a second, I thought I saw the veins beneath the skin pulse with a faint, greenish light. I tightened the bandage, grit my teeth, and pushed open the heavy steel door to the surface, emerging into the gray, radioactive rain. The hospital stood silent behind me, a tomb that had just birthed a monster, and I carried its legacy in my blood and in my backpack. The airlock wheel groaned with a sound like dying metal, echoing through the sterile purgatory of the decontamination chamber. I held my breath, listening. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized, pressing against my eardrums. My Geiger counter sat clipped to my chest rig, clicking a rhythmic, low-level warning, a heartbeat of invisible poison. I was inside. The map I'd pulled off a dead stalker 3 days ago called this place Object 72. A Soviet-era black site buried beneath the foundation of a generic Pripyat hospital. But the dust here didn't smell like old concrete. It smelled like copper and ozone. It smelled like fresh meat. I clicked my headlamp to the red filter to save my night vision and pushed through the inner seal. The corridor beyond was a throat of industrial tiling, slick with a condensation that I prayed was just water. Scavenging in the zone is about risk management, but this was greed. The rumors spoke of experimental viral suppressants, military-grade coagulants, ampoules of adrenaline that hadn't expired in 1991. I needed them. My camp was running on fumes and dirty bandages. The first room on the left was a nurse's station, or at least, the military equivalent. I vaulted the counter, boots crunching on shattered glass. The drawers were ransacked, but the scavengers had been sloppy. They'd looked for narcotics and missed the utility. I found a box of sterile sutures and a sealed pack of potassium iodide tablets tucked behind a rotten logbook. I swept them into my pack. The logbook lay open, pages stiff with dry brown fluid. The dates weren't from the 80s. The last entry was 6 months ago. Subject 14 exhibiting hyperadrenal response. Tissue density increasing. Radiation is acting as a catalyst, not a decaying agent. I froze. The zone's zombies, the shambles we popped from 50 yards away, were rotting meat puppets. They were slow, stupid, falling apart. If the infection was evolving, if it was using the radiation to build rather than destroy, we were fighting the wrong war. I shoved the logbook into my dump pouch. Intel was worth as much as medicine to the traders at the bar. I moved deeper, the clicking on my chest picking up tempo. The signage changed from standard Cyrillic to international biohazard warnings. I reached the pharmacy storage. The door had been ripped off its hinges, bent outward. Whatever opened this didn't use a key, it used hydraulic force. Inside, shelves lined the walls, floor to ceiling. It was a gold mine. I grabbed armfuls of broad-spectrum antibiotics, stuffing them into the side pockets of my ruck. Then I saw the cooler unit. The generator backup light was dead, but the thermal insulation held. Inside were vials of blue liquid labeled V-suppressant. I didn't know if it was a cure or a poison, but I took every single one. That's when I heard the chittering. It wasn't a groan. It was a wet, clicking sound, like teeth snapping together rapidly. I killed my light instantly, crouching behind a metal prep table. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint, sickly green luminescence of radium paint on the emergency exit signs. Something moved in the corridor. Through the gap in the doorframe, I saw a silhouette. It was human-shaped, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, dragging on the floor, and the spine was hunched, bulbous. It stepped into the faint green glow, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. The creature had no skin on its chest. Instead, a calcified plating had formed, like an exoskeleton made of bone and tumorous growth. It didn't shuffle, it twitched with terrifying kinetic energy. The radiation hadn't killed the virus, it had mutated it, supercharging the cellular regeneration. This thing wasn't rotting. It was growing. It turned its head, and I saw that its eyes were gone, replaced by patches of bioluminescent fungi that seemed to track heat or movement. It sniffed the air, the sound wet and snuffling. I had a suppressed pistol, a meager 9mm against bone plating, and a machete. I needed to move. The clicking of my Geiger counter was the only sound I couldn't stop. The creature's head snapped toward me. It heard the radiation detector. Panic is a killer, so I forced it down, gripping the handle of the machete. The creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and lunged. It crossed the 20 feet between us in a blink. I threw myself to the right, the prep table crunching as the thing slammed into it, tossing the heavy steel furniture aside like cardboard. I scrambled up, aiming the pistol at the soft tissue of its neck, the only vulnerable spot I could see. I double-tapped. Asterisk fut-fut. Asterisk. Black blood sprayed, but the thing didn't drop. It thrashed, screaming that high-pitched shriek, and swiped blindly. A clawed hand caught my backpack strap, spinning me around. I felt the fabric tear, heard the precious vials clinking. I couldn't lose the loot. I twisted, unsheathing the machete, and brought it down with every ounce of desperate strength I had onto the creature's extended arm. The blade bit deep, but it didn't cleave bone. It stuck. The creature roared, yanking its arm back and pulling me with it. I let go of the handle, falling backward onto the slick tile, scrambling away on my ass. The thing loomed over me, the machete protruding from its forearm like a splinter. It raised the other claw to eviscerate me. Then, the clicking on my chest screamed. Not a warning, but a flatline tone. Radiation spike. The creature convulsed. The fungal patches on its face flared bright green, and it vomited a torrent of caustic bile onto the floor where I had been a second ago. The concrete hissed and smoked. It was overloaded. The radiation it used for fuel was volatile. I saw my chance. I grabbed a glass beaker from the floor debris and hurled it down the hall. The smash echoed like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, its sensory organs confused. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted the opposite way, toward the emergency stairwell. I didn't look back. I could hear it tearing down the hall behind me, its footsteps heavy, metallic, relentless. I hit the stairwell door, slamming the push bar. Rust flaked off, and the door screamed open. I threw myself through and wedged a piece of rebar I kept for leverage through the handles. A second later, the door shuddered violently. A dent appeared in the steel. Then another. It was battering its way through. I ran up the stairs, skipping steps, my lungs burning. The air grew colder as I ascended, the metallic tang replaced by the familiar scent of rain and pine. I burst onto the roof level, the gray sky of the zone greeting me like an old friend. I collapsed against a ventilation unit, gasping, checking my pack. 3 vials broken. The rest intact. The antibiotics were safe. I looked at the Geiger counter. The reading was dropping, but the needle was still jittery. I pulled the logbook out again, my hands shaking. Evolution is inevitable, a handwritten note in the margins read. We tried to weaponize the dead. The zone weaponized them back. I looked over the edge of the roof. Below, in the courtyard, I saw them. Not 1 or 2, but a dozen. They were standing still, faces turned upward toward the falling rain, the bioluminescent patches on their faces glowing softly in the twilight. They were evolving. They were organizing. And I was the only one who knew. I holstered my gun, cinched my torn straps tight, and began the long climb down the drainage pipe. The loot was heavy, but the knowledge weighed more. The hospitals weren't safe. The radiation wasn't a barrier anymore. It was their battery. We had to move the camp. We had to move it now. The Geiger counter clipped to my chest wasn't ticking anymore. It was purring, a low, static growl that vibrated against my sternum. I stood before the reinforced blast doors of the Pripyat 17 biocontainment unit, a brittleless slab of concrete half swallowed by the red forest. The moss clinging to the walls wasn't green. It was a sick, iridescent purple, pulsing faintly in the gloom of the overcast zone sky. I adjusted the straps of my respirator, checking the seal. The air outside tasted of copper and ozone, but inside I knew it would smell of ancient death. With a groan of rusted hydraulics, I engaged the manual override wheel. It fought me, the metal cold enough to burn through my gloves. Before the mechanism surrendered with a deafening crack that echoed through the dead city. The doors parted just enough for me to slip through. The lobby was a tomb of silent chaos. Triage tents set up decades ago had collapsed into heaps of moldering canvas. I kept my weapon, a suppressed carbine scavenged from a fallen military stalker, raised and tight to my shoulder. My tack light cut a cone through the dust motes, revealing the first signs that this wasn't a standard outbreak site. The skeletons scattered across the floor weren't picked clean. They were fused to the terrazzo tiles by a hardened, resin-like secretion. I knelt by a corpse wearing a shredded lab coat. This was the scavenging phase, the part where greed overrode fear. I needed antibiotics, filters, and high-grade chemical stabilizers. My fingers, clumsy in thick rubber gloves, patted down the pockets. Nothing but a crumbled ID card and a set of brass keys. But the body itself. I shined the light on the ribcage. The bone hadn't just broken, it had bloomed. Sharp, coral-like osseous spurs jutted outward, piercing the fabric. The infection here didn't just kill the host, it rewrote their biology to weaponize the remains. I moved deeper, stepping over a barricade of overturned gurneys. The deeper I went, the higher the radiation spiked. My dosimeter chirped an urgent warning, forcing me to pop an iodine tablet dry. I swallowed the bitter pill and pushed into the decontamination corridor. Here, the loot improved. A wall-mounted emergency locker had been bypassed by looters who lacked the strength to pry it open. I jammed my crowbar into the seam, leaning my entire body weight into it until the metal shrieked and gave way. Jackpot. Inside were 3 sealed injectors of epinephrine and a box of military-grade hazmat filters. I swapped the canister on my mask immediately, the hiss of fresh filtration sounding like a gasp of relief. As I stowed the adrenaline, I heard it, the sound of wet leather sliding over tile. I froze, killing my light. In the pitch black of the hospital corridor, the zone's ambient radiation provided a ghost light. Down the hall, a silhouette detached itself from the ceiling. It wasn't shambling. It was clinging to the ventilation ducts like an insect. The evolution of the virus in the zone had diverged wildly from the urban strains. The radiation acted as a mutagenic catalyst, accelerating muscle density and altering bone structure. The creature dropped to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. It stood on all fours, its spine elongated and serrated. I could see the glow of Cherenkov radiation emanating from a tumorous sac on its throat. It was a Geiger ghoul, a local nickname for the infected that had stewed in Hiram hotspots. If it got close, the radiation burns would kill me faster than its teeth. I didn't wait for it to scream. I snapped the light back on, blinding it momentarily, and fired. The suppressor coughed, thwip, thwip, thwip. 2 rounds to the chest, 1 to the head. The chest shots sparked against calcified skin plates, but the headshot found soft tissue. The creature collapsed, thrashing as black, bioluminescent blood sprayed the walls. The blood hissed where it touched the paint, acidic and hot. I moved past it quickly, careful not to step in the sludge. The scavenging run had just turned into a hunt. I needed to reach the sub-basement levels. That's where the prototype labs were. That's where the rumors said the Soviets had stored the Chimera samples before the evacuation. The stairwell was blocked by a solidified mass of biomass, a fleshy wall where several bodies had melted together, fusing into the concrete. I had to use the service elevator shaft, rappelling down the cables into the abyss. The air grew colder, heavy with a metallic taste that penetrated even my mask. B-Level 3. The doors were pried open, revealing a sterile white hallway that looked untouched by time, preserved in a vacuum of horror. This was the clean zone. I checked a supply cart. Unopened boxes of sterile gauze, surgical tools, and my heart skipped a beat, a portable centrifuge. Useless for survival, but valuable to the traders back at the cordon. I bagged the small tech components, stripping the copper wiring and rare earth magnets from the heavy machinery. Every ounce counted. Then I found the observation deck. The glass was 3 inches thick, lead-lined. Beyond it lay the main synthesis chamber. In the center of the room, suspended in a shattered vat of yellow fluid, was something that defied logic. It was a massive heart, size of a sedan, hooked up to geothermal pipes. But it wasn't pumping blood. It was pulsing with spore clouds. The ventilation system. I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins that the hospital wasn't trying to cure the virus. The hospital was the lung. It was pumping the mutated strain out into the zone's atmosphere. The evolution wasn't accidental. It was engineered adaptation. I scanned the console in front of me. A dusty logbook lay open. Subject 44 Delta shows integration with fungal strata. Host no longer requires caloric intake. Sustenance derived from ionizing radiation. I was reading the birth certificate of a new species. I frantically swept the desk, dumping drive hard disks and encrypted folders into my pack. This was pay dirt. This was the info the ecologists would kill for. But the noise of my looting drew attention. Inside the synthesis chamber, the shadows moved. Not one or two, but a legion. They were dormant, huddled around the pulsing heart like worshippers. My movement disturbed them. A collective hiss rose, vibrating against the glass. One of them slammed into the window. It had no eyes, just a smooth surface of scar tissue and sensory pits. It screamed, a high-frequency shriek that cracked the reinforced glass. Panic is a killer, so I forced myself to breathe. Loot first, escape second. I grabbed a sealed vial of the yellow fluid, the raw mutagen. As I shoved it into my padded case, the glass wall gave way. The alarm klaxons, silent for 30 years, suddenly grown to life, triggered by the breach. Red emergency lights bathed the lab in blood-colored strobes. The infected poured through the broken window, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that zombie fiction never prepared you for. They didn't stumble, they flowed. I turned and sprinted, abandoning stealth. I hip-fired behind me, the rounds tearing through the lead zombies, but for every one I dropped, 3 more scrambled over the bodies. They were a hive mind, coordinated by the pheromones releasing from the central heart. I hit the stairwell, vaulting over the railing to bypass the block section, landing hard on the landing below. My ankle screamed in protest, but the adrenaline masked the pain. I could hear them skittering down the walls above me, their claws tearing into the concrete. I needed a distraction. I pulled a flare from my vest, cracked it, and taped it to a propane canister I'd noted earlier near the maintenance closet. I rolled the improvised bomb toward the shaft and kicked the door shut just as the blast wave hit. The explosion was muffled, but the structural damage was immediate. The stairwell above collapsed in a cascade of rubble and dust, sealing the route and burying the lead pursuers. Dust choked the air, reducing visibility to 0. I crawled through the debris, coughing into my mask. I was back on the ground floor, but the noise had woken the entire building. The fused statues in the lobby were cracking open, the dormant infected inside shedding their calcified shells like cicadas. I had to move. I smashed through the front glass, tumbling out onto the radioactive asphalt of the parking lot. The sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows across the zone. I didn't stop running until I hit the tree line, the Geiger counter screaming a warning that I was pushing my limit. I collapsed behind a rusted truck, checking my loot. The injectors, the filters, the drive, and the mutagen sample. I had survived the hospital, but as I looked back at the looming silhouette of the facility, I saw the purple moss on the walls glowing brighter, pulsing in time with my own heartbeat. The infection was learning, and I had just rung the dinner bell. The dosimeter clipped to my tactical vest chirped every 3 seconds, a metronome counting down the moments until my bone marrow turned to soup. Pripyat was bad, but this was the heart of the rot. The abandoned bioweapon facility, designated Object 22 Beta, sat half-buried in the red forest. A brutalist slab of concrete strangled by vines that pulsed with an unnatural, violet bioluminescence. I wasn't here for the view. My gas mask filters were pushing 40 hours, and the infection in my left calf was burning hot enough to steam up the glass of my visor. I needed a med bay, specifically a level 4 containment lab, or I was going to become just another radioactive smear on the zone's history. I wedged the pry bar into the seam of the airlock doors. The hydraulics had died decades ago, likely when the backup generators flooded. With a groan of rusted metal that echoed like a gunshot in the silence, the doors gave way, exhaling a gust of stale, pressurized air that smelled of ozone and copper. I slipped inside, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the lobby. It wasn't the chaotic mess of the city hospitals, with overturned gurneys and skeletons in the waiting room. This place was sterile, dustless, preserved. That terrified me more than the gore. It meant the automated sterilization systems had been running long after the bombs fell. It meant there was power somewhere deep below. My boots squeaked on the pristine linoleum as I moved toward the triage station. The map on the wall, peeling at the corners, indicated that viral pathology was 3 floors down. The elevator was a dead coffin, so I took the stairs, keeping my silenced PMM raised. The clicking of the dosimeter sped up as I descended. The radiation here wasn't background noise. It was leaking from something specific. On the second landing, I found the first body. It wasn't a standard shambler. It was a scientist in a hazmat suit, but the suit hadn't been breached from the outside. It had burst from the inside. I knelt, examining the tear. The flesh underneath was gray, hardened like calcified rock, and where the veins should have been, there were tracks of glowing blue sludge. The infection in the zone wasn't just killing people anymore. It was synthesizing the radiation, using it to build something stronger. I reached the 3rd basement level. The air grew heavy, humming with a low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth. I bypassed the main corridor, too exposed, and slipped into a storage room labeled hazardous waste. This was a gold mine. I swept shelves into my pack, sealed syringes of epinephrine, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and iodine tablets. My hand shook as I injected a suppressor into my thigh, the needle biting deep. The relief wouldn't be instant, but it would buy me a few hours before the fever took my mind. I was about to leave when I saw the containment unit in the back. The glass was reinforced, 3 inches thick. Inside, suspended in a tank of yellow fluid, was a torso. Just a torso. But it was alive. The muscle fibers twitched in rhythm with the facility's hum. Tubes fed directly into the spinal column, pumping a neon green reagent. I wiped the grime off a clipboard hanging next to the tank. Subject 7 Delta. Strain evolution, 98%. Radiotrophic adaptation confirmed. The host no longer requires oxygen. It feeds on ionizing radiation. I felt a cold sweat break on the back of my neck. They hadn't been trying to cure the zombie plague. They had been trying to weaponize it to survive the fallout. They made them immortal. A crash from the hallway shattered my focus. It sounded like wet pottery smashing against a wall. I killed my light, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint glow of the specimen tank. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, a chittering, clicking noise like a Geiger counter possessed by a demon. Footsteps. Heavy. Uneven. But fast. I peered through the slat in the door. The creature moving down the corridor was a nightmare born of uranium and virus. It stood 7 feet tall, its skin a translucent husk revealing a skeletal structure that had thickened into natural armor. Where its eyes should have been, tumors had bloomed, glowing with Cherenkov radiation. It didn't see with light, it sensed the radiation signatures. And I, with my contaminated gear and the fresh iodine in my blood, was a beacon. It stopped outside the door. The head snapped toward me, the glowing tumors pulsing. It let out a shriek that wasn't vocal. It was a burst of static that scrambled my headset and made my nose bleed. It knew. I didn't wait. I kicked the door open, firing 3 rounds into its center of mass. The bullets sparked off the calcified ribcage, ricocheting down the hall. The creature didn't even flinch. It lunged, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I dove to the right, sliding across the polished floor as a clawed hand smashed a crater into the concrete where my head had been. I scrambled up, sprinting toward the decontamination showers. The creature roared behind me, a sound of tearing metal. I needed a trap. My bullets were useless against that armor. I unclipped a frag grenade, but I knew the blast radius in this confined space would liquefy my insides too. Then I saw it, the emergency purge system for the decontamination chamber. I vaulted over a gurney, sliding into the glass-walled shower room. The creature crashed through the partition a second later, glass raining down like diamonds. It was fast, but it was heavy. Its momentum carried it past me, its claws gouging deep furrows in the wall. I slammed the mag lock button on the far door, sealing the exit. I was trapped in the glass box with it, but I was on the clean side of the heavy inner airlock. The creature turned, its glowing face inches from mine, separated only by the reinforced glass of the inner partition. It raised a fist to shatter the barrier. I smashed the emergency sterilization button. Jets of liquid nitrogen and high-concentrate acid sprayed from the sealing nozzles on the creature's side of the chamber. The beast screamed, the sound muffled by the glass, as the extreme cold shattered its hardened carapace, and the acid went to work on the soft, glowing tissue beneath. I watched, chest heaving, as the immortal super-soldier dissolved into a pile of smoking, glowing sludge. The radiation alarm on my chest was redlining. The creature's death had released a massive spike of gamma rays. I had to move now. I grabbed a keycard from a dead technician in the corner of the room and forced the exit door. The hallway beyond led to the deeper labs, but I was done. I had my meds. I had the intel. The infection was evolving. It was learning to eat the very thing that destroyed the world. As I limped back toward the stairs, I heard it, a chorus of chittering, clicking screams rising from the elevator shaft. There were more of them. Hundreds more. And they were waking up. The Geiger counter clipped to my webbing wasn't just clicking anymore. It was purring, a low, static growl that vibrated against my collarbone. I stood before the airlock of Object 22B, a brittlest slab of concrete hidden beneath the overgrowth of the red forest. The map I'd pulled off a dead stalker 2 weeks ago called it a trauma center. But the 3-inch steel blast doors and the biohazard trefoils painted in fading yellow told a different story. This was a fortress of biology, a place where the Soviets, and later the shadowy syndicates of the zone, tried to weaponize the very thing that broke the world. I cycled the wheel on the airlock. Rust flaked off in jagged scabs, dusting my gloves. With a screech of metal shearing against metal, the door gave way, exhaling a breath of stale, pressurized air that smelled of ozone and formaldehyde. I pushed inside, swinging the beam of my tactical light into the abyss. The silence here was heavy, physical. It pressed against my eardrums, louder than the wind howling through the pine trees outside. I checked my gas mask seal, tightened the straps, and stepped into the decontamination chamber. The showers were dry, the nozzles clogged with decades of grime, but the floor was littered with plastic wrapping. Someone had been here. Recently? No, the plastic was brittle, yellowed by UV lamps that had long since burned out. My priority was the pharmacy. In the zone, bullets were currency, but antibiotics were life. I moved through the triage area, stepping over overturned gurneys and shattered 4 poles. The floor was a mosaic of refuse, clipboards, shredded hazmat suits, and bones. Not human bones, though. These were wrong. I knelt to examine a femur shattered on the linoleum. It was porous, like coral, and heavy. Too heavy. The marrow cavity was filled with a crystallized black substance that shimmered under my light. This was the evolution the rumors spoke of. In the cities, the infected were shambling corpses, rotting until they fell apart. Here, in the soup of background radiation, the virus wasn't destroying the host, it was rebuilding it. I reached a double door marked Quarantine Ward 4. The glass was reinforced with wire mesh, smeared with dried fluids that blocked the view. I nudged the door with the barrel of my suppressed carbine. It swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. Strange. Everything else in this place was seized by rust. Someone wanted this door to open easily. I swept the room. It was a gallery of horrors. Glass tanks lined the walls, most shattered, but a few still intact, filled with murky amber preservation fluid. Floating inside were organs, hearts, lungs, brains, but swollen, covered in chitinous plates and glowing nodes. The virus here had adapted to the high-energy particles bombarding the zone. It was using radiation as a fuel source, catalyzing rapid cellular regeneration that bordered on uncontrolled malignancy. I found the pharmacy station at the rear of the ward. The security gate was pulled down, but the lock had been melted with thermite. A professional job. I squeezed under the gap, my pack scraping against the metal. Inside, it was a scavenger's Valhalla. Rows of shelves stripped bare in places, but the back stock, deep storage. I pulled open a drawer and my heart hammered. Ampoules of morphine, blister packs of broad-spectrum antibiotics, adrenaline injectors, even anti-radiation drugs like cysteamine. I swept them into my pack, wrapping the glass vials in gauze to silence them. This haul alone could buy me a ticket out of the zone, or at least a month of safety at the bar. Then I heard it. Not a footstep. A click. Like the sound of a cooling engine, or a joint popping. It came from the ceiling. I froze, killing my light. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint, sickly green luminescence of the emergency exit signs running on nuclear batteries. I held my breath, listening. Asterisk click. Scrape. Drip. Asterisk. Something was moving in the ventilation ducts above me. The metal groaned, bending under significant weight. Dust motes danced in the sliver of green light. I slowly backed away from the shelves, raising my carbine. The vent cover directly above the pharmacy counter exploded outward. A mass of gray flesh and torn fabric slammed into the floor where I had been standing seconds ago. I hit the strobe on my weapon light, blinding the thing. It was humanoid, but only just. It wore the shredded remnants of a scientist's lab coat, fused into its skin. Its height was monstrous, maybe 7 feet if it stood straight, but it was hunched, its spine twisted into a jagged ridge of bone spurs. One arm ended in a normal hand, the fingers elongated into talons. The other arm was gone, replaced by a massive, calcified growth that looked like a shield or a club. But the face was a crater. The jaw had unhinged and split, revealing rows of needle teeth that spiraled down into a gullet glowing with ionizing blue light. It hissed, and the sound was like steam escaping a valve. This was a Phase 4. I'd read the documents in the reception. The infection in the zone didn't just reanimate, it mutated based on environmental stress. The radiation had hardened this thing, turning its skin into a natural lead vest. Standard rounds would bounce off that carapace. It lunged. The speed was terrifying for something that size. I dove over the counter, glass shattering under my boots. The creature smashed its club arm into the shelving unit, crumpling the steel like tin foil. Pills and bottles rained down like hail. I scrambled backward, firing a 3-round burst into its chest. The bullets sparked off the gray hide, leaving only shallow divots. It didn't even flinch. It turned its eyeless head toward me, sensing the heat or the movement. I needed to hit the soft tissue. The glowing gullet. The thing roared, a sound that distorted the air pressure in the room, and charged through the counter debris. I rolled to the left, narrowly avoiding the swing that pulverized the linoleum floor. I was cornered against the reinforced glass of the drug storage. No exit. I grabbed a glass jar of ethanol from a shelf and hurled it. It smashed against the creature's chest, drenching it. It paused, confused by the scent. I racked the bolt. One shot. I needed one clean shot. The creature shrieked and opened its maw to bite. The blue light flared deep in its throat. I squeezed the trigger. The round entered the open mouth, punching through the soft palate and into the brain stem. But I didn't stop there. The tracer round ignited the ethanol fumes. The creature became a torch. It flailed, thrashing against the shelves, bringing the entire pharmacy structure down on top of itself. I shielded my face from the heat, the smell of burning ozone and rotten meat choking me even through the mask. I didn't wait to see if it died. I scrambled under the security gate, dragging my pack. The screeching behind me turned into a gurgling wet rattle, then silence. I sprinted back through the quarantine ward, the adrenaline making my hands shake uncontrollably. The noise would draw others. The hospital wasn't empty, it was a hive. As I reached the triage area, I saw them. Shadows detaching from the walls. More of them. Smaller, faster variants, scurrying on all fours like spiders. Their eyes glowed with that same radioactive blue. They weren't hunting by sight. They were hunting by the radiation signature of my gear, or maybe the noise of the fight. The evolution was hive-minded. I had rung the dinner bell. I bolted for the airlock, my boots slipping on the slick floor. I could hear the scrabbling of claws on tile behind me, closing the distance. I threw myself into the decontamination chamber and spun the wheel. The heavy steel door began to close, agonizingly slow. A hand, pale, skeletal, and dripping with black ichor, shot through the gap, grasping at my webbing. I drew my combat knife and severed the fingers in one chaotic slash. The hand recoiled, and the door slammed shut. I spun the locking mechanism until my muscles burned, sealing the tomb. I collapsed against the cold metal of the outer door, gasping for air. The Geiger counter was screaming now, the needle buried in the red. I looked at the severed fingers on the floor of the airlock. They were still moving, twitching, trying to crawl toward me. And where the bone was exposed, it wasn't white. It was metallic. I grabbed the loot, kicked the outer door open, and stumbled out into the gray light of the Chernobyl evening. The hospital loomed behind me, silent again, but I knew better. It was an incubator. The virus was learning. It was armoring itself. And sooner or later those things would figure out how to work the door. The Geiger counter on my hip was no longer clicking. It was screaming, a low-level static buzz that vibrated against my thigh bone, warning me that I was crossing a threshold from which my DNA might never recover. The blast doors of Object 19, the hidden bioweapon facility masked as a tuberculosis ward deep within the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, hadn't been opened since 1986. Or so I thought. The rusted wheel of the airlock turned with a screech that sounded like a dying animal, echoing through the concrete sarcophagus of the entryway. I pushed. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized, stale air that smelled of ozone, copper, and something sweet, like rotting lilies. I checked my gas mask seal for the third time in a minute. The filters were rated for biological and radiological threats, but trust is a luxury I lost months ago. I stepped inside. The emergency lights were dead, but the facility wasn't dark. It was illuminated by the faint, sickly green bioluminescence of fungi that had colonized the damp drywall. This was the first sign that the infection here had evolved differently than the shamblers in the cities. The virus outside made things dead. The virus inside the zone, fed by decades of unchecked ionizing radiation, made things proliferate. My boots crunched over shattered glass and calcified remains in the triage lobby. It wasn't just bones. The skeletons here were fused to the linoleum, wrapped in hardened, resin-like secretions. I kept my suppressed carbine raised, the flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes. Scavenging Priority 1, Antibiotics. Priority 2, Filters. Priority 3, anything that could explain why the infected outside were starting to migrate toward the reactor. I vaulted over the reception desk, landing softly on a pile of decomposed paperwork. Department of Viroradiology read a plaque on the wall, now half consumed by a pulsating gray moss. I rifled through the drawers. Nothing but dried pens and logbooks crumbling to dust. I moved deeper, toward the pharmaceutical storage. The layout was labyrinthine, designed to confuse or perhaps contain. As I moved down the main corridor, I saw the first one. It wasn't a walker. It was a fixture. A human torso, clad in the tatters of a hazmat suit, had merged with the ceiling pipes. Its legs were gone, replaced by thick, fleshy tendrils that wrapped around the conduit like ivy. The skin was translucent, revealing organs that glowed with a faint Cherenkov radiation blue. It was dormant, a sleeping sentinel. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was the evolution. The virus here didn't just reanimate. It utilized the host to build a hive. It was turning the building itself into a living organism. I crept past, stepping carefully to avoid the viscous puddles beneath it. I reached the pharmacy door, reinforced glass, shattered from the inside. Bad sign. I swept the room. Empty shelves. Someone, or something, had cleaned it out. But the scavengers usually missed the floor stashes. I knelt, pushing aside a heavy metal cabinet with a grunt of effort. Beneath it, a loose floor tile. I pried it up. Jackpot. A stash box, likely hidden by a nurse or doctor hoping to come back. Inside were 3 ampoules of morphine, a blister pack of broad-spectrum antibiotics, and miraculously, a sealed box of iodine tablets. I pocketed them instantly. The economy of survival is weight versus utility. These were worth their weight in gold. A wet slap echoed from the corridor. I froze. The sound came again, wet, heavy, like a slab of meat hitting concrete. I killed my flashlight. In the green gloom of the fungal walls, I saw movement near the sentinel on the ceiling. The tendrils were twitching. The sentinel's head, previously slumped, snapped up. It didn't have eyes anymore. The sockets were filled with crystalline growths. It let out a sound, not a moan, but a high-frequency click, like a bat using echolocation. Suddenly, the vents above me rattled. The infection here had adapted to the dark, to the confined spaces. I backed into the pharmacy, raising my rifle. The creature in the vents dropped. It was small, maybe a child once, but now it was a spider-like horror, limbs elongated and broken at the joints to allow for quadrupedal movement. Its skin was hard, covered in keratin plates that looked like tumors. It hissed, mandibles spreading to reveal rows of needle teeth dripping with neon-green saliva. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed the trigger. The suppressor coughed, thwip, thwip, thwip. The rounds hit the creature in the chest, but they didn't penetrate deep. They shattered against the calcified tumor plates. The kinetic energy knocked it back, but it scrambled upright instantly. Standard ballistics were useless against the calcified variants. I switched to the underbarrel shotgun. The creature lunged. I pulled the secondary trigger. The boom was deafening in the small room. The buckshot tore through the softer neck tissue, decapitating the thing in a spray of acidic blood that hissed where it hit the floor. I didn't wait to see it twitch. The gunshot would draw everything in the sector. I grabbed a handful of sterile gauze from a torn package on the floor and sprinted out the back exit of the pharmacy, heading deeper into the labs. The deeper I went, the hotter the radiation became. My dosimeter was now a constant, angry buzz. I popped 2 iodine tablets, chewing them dry, swallowing the bitter taste of fear. The walls here were pulsing. The biomass wasn't just growing on the walls, it was the walls. Veins the thickness of fire hoses ran along the floor, pumping nutrients, or virus, to the heart of the facility. I found the main lab, a clean room that had been sealed hermetically. The biomass hadn't breached it yet. I cycled the airlock and stepped into the stark white silence of the past. In the center of the room was a containment unit. Inside, suspended in yellow liquid, was a subject. It wasn't human. It was a splice. The medical charts on the desk were preserved. I scanned them frantically. Project Chimera. Viral strain reaction to gamma radiation. 400% increase in cellular regeneration. Subject 001 exhibits hive mind latency. My hands shook as I shoved the research notes into my pack. This was the missing link. The virus wasn't just biological. It was radiotrophic. It fed on the fallout. That's why the hordes were moving to the reactor. They weren't migrating. They were going to feed. They were going to evolve into something indestructible. I grabbed a rack of experimental antivirals from the cold storage unit, vials marked with hazardous skull symbols. Risky, but if there was a cure or a weapon, it was in that liquid. Then, the alarms triggered. A red strobe began to flash, silent but terrifying. The containment unit in the center of the room began to drain. The glass cracked. The subject, 7 feet of muscle and bone armor, with spikes of crystallized bone protruding from its spine, opened its eyes. They were burning with red light. I didn't fight. You don't fight a tank with a rifle. I turned and ran for the emergency stairwell, smashing the glass of the fire exit. The roar behind me shook the foundations of the hospital, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was the sound of the atoms splitting. Given a voice. I took the stairs 3 at a time, sliding down the railings, the metal screeching. Below me, the hive was waking up. The walls were birthing them, peeling away to reveal drones stepping out of the biomass. I burst out onto the second-floor gantry, the cool night air of the zone hitting me like a physical blow. I was high up, looking down at the overgrown courtyard. It was full of them. Hundreds. Glowing in the dark like a constellation of death, looking up at me. The subject crashed through the wall behind me, sending debris flying into the abyss. I had the data. I had the samples. Now I just had to survive the fall. I hooked my rappel line to the railing, kicked off, and plummeted into the darkness, the scream of the evolved echoing in my ears. The airlock wheel groaned with the rusty protest of 3 decades of neglect, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent red forest surrounding the facility. I paused, holding my breath, watching the tree lean. Nothing moved but the gray dust kicking up around my boots. The Geiger counter on my chest clicked a slow, rhythmic lullaby. Background radiation, manageable for now, but rising. This was Sector 4, the unmarked blister on the map that the locals whispered was a Soviet black site masquerading as an isolation ward. They called it the incubator. I pushed inside. The pressure seal broke with a wet hiss, the smell of stale ozone and copper hitting me instantly. It didn't smell like rot, it smelled like electricity and dried blood. I clicked my headlamp on, the beam cutting through the suspended particulate matter. The lobby was a tomb of administrative decay. Papers were scattered across the floor, not from wind, but from a hasty evacuation. I knelt by the reception desk, my gloved fingers rifling through the debris. Scavenging wasn't about grabbing everything. It was about grabbing the right things. Weight was death. I found a box of unchecked intake forms, useless, but beneath them, a pristine blister pack of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Even 30 years expired, Soviet military-grade meds held their potency better than the garbage traded at the safe zones. I pocketed them. My pack was light, but my ammunition count was lower than I liked. 2 mags for the AK, 6 shells for the shotgun. Moving deeper, the architecture began to shift. The utilitarian beige tiles of the lobby gave way to reinforced concrete and lead-lined glass. This wasn't a hospital. It was a containment vessel. The clicking on my chest sped up, asterisk click 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 asterisk, warning of hot spots. I navigated the hallway, stepping over a gurney that had been overturned. There was a skeleton beneath it, but the bones were wrong. I shone the light closer. The ribcage hadn't decomposed, it had calcified, fusing together into a solid plate of bone armor. The skull was elongated, the jaw unhinged and fused open. This wasn't the standard Shambarat I'd seen in the outskirts. This was evolution. I reached a triage station marked Quarantine Zone B. The heavy blast doors were jammed open by a mass of what looked like black coral. I approached cautiously, raising the shotgun. It wasn't coral. It was biomass, necrotic tissue that had bloomed and hardened, acting like a bridge for the infection to spread across the architecture. I scraped a sample with my knife. It sparked. Literal sparks. The infection here had adapted to the high radiation, becoming radiotrophic. It was feeding on the fallout, integrating the energy into the biological matrix. I slipped through the gap in the doors. Inside, the scavenging potential skyrocketed. Rows of metal cabinets lined the walls. I holstered the shotgun and pried the first one open with my crowbar. The metal screeched, and I froze, waiting. Silence returned. Inside the cabinet, jackpot. Sealed glass ampoules of morphine, syringes, and most importantly, heavy-duty distinct anti-rad injectors, the kind with the blue caps. I swept them into my pack, wrapping them in rags to stop the clinking. Then I saw the logbook on the desk. The final entry was scrawled in frantic Cyrillic. *Subject 44 is absorbing the isotopes. It's not dying. It's glowing. *. A wet slap of meat on tile made me spin around. At the far end of the ward, illuminated only by the faint, eerie blue Cherenkov radiation leaking from a broken reactor pipe in the ceiling, something stood up. It was humanoid, but stretched. The skin was translucent, pulling tight over blackened veins that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly light. It didn't have eyes. The sockets were overgrown with that same black coral. It twitched, sniffing the air. It could smell the iodine in my blood. I backed up slowly, my boot crunching on a glass vial. The sound was deafening. The creature's head snapped toward me, its fused jaw vibrating. It didn't scream. It emitted a high-frequency burst of static, like a detuning radio. I leveled the shotgun. It moved with terrifying speed, a blur of luminescent limbs. I fired. The buckshot hit center mass, but instead of tearing through soft rot, it sparked against the calcified rib plate. The kinetic impact knocked it back, but didn't drop it. It scrambled onto the walls, its fingers digging into the concrete like climbing picks. This was the apex of the infection, a predator designed for the zone. I pumped the action, firing again at its limbs. The shot shattered its left arm, spraying glowing blue fluid that hissed where it hit the floor. The creature fell, thrashing. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted toward the laboratory annex, the heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. Behind me, the static screech multiplied. There wasn't just one. I slammed through the double doors of the lab, jamming the crowbar through the handles to barricade it. The glass window in the door cracked as a body slammed against it from the other side. I scanned the room. Biohazard containment. In the center, a centrifuge sat idle. But on the far wall, a refrigerated storage unit hummed, powered by God knows what backup generator. I ran to it. The temperature gauge read 4 degrees Celsius. Miraculous. I yanked the latch. Cold mist rolled out. Inside weren't just meds, these were samples. Vials labeled Chimera Strain 4. But on the bottom shelf, I found what I really needed, a hazmat filtration upgrade and a box of sealed military ration packs. I grabbed the filters, my mask was running on fumes, and swapped the canister with trembling hands. The first breath of clean, scrubbed air was like pure oxygen. The barricaded door groaned. The glass spiderwebbed. A fist, glowing with that terrible radiation, punched through, grasping blindly. I saw the Geiger counter spike to red. Being near them was cooking me. I needed an exit. I looked around. A ventilation shaft above the fume hood. It was tight, but it led out. I dragged a heavy lab stool over, climbed up, and kicked the grate in. It clattered into the duct. I pulled myself up just as the lab doors burst open. The crowbar snapped like a twig. 3 of the radiotrophic horrors poured in, their bodies illuminating the dark room like deep-sea nightmares. They shrieked at the empty room, overturning tables, smashing the equipment. They were hunting, intelligent and furious. I crawled through the vents, the metal freezing against my stomach. The dust here was thick, radioactive fluff. I held my breath, crawling until I saw light, gray, dull daylight. I kicked the external grate loose and tumbled out onto the wet grass behind the hospital, rolling to break the fall. The air outside was cold. I scrambled up, checking my gear. The ampoules were safe. The antirads were intact. I looked back at the hospital. The windows of the 3rd floor were flickering with blue light, shadows darting back and forth. The infection hadn't just survived the end of the world, it was building a new one. I adjusted my pack, the weight of the scavenged loot pressing reassuringly against my spine, and turned north. The zone was evolving, and if I wanted to survive tomorrow, I had to be faster, smarter, and more ruthless than the things growing in the dark. The dosimeter on my shoulder wasn't just clicking anymore. It was buzzing like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. The distinct, rhythmic fracture of silence was the only thing keeping me grounded in the gray, washed-out reality of the exclusion zone. Before me stood Object 19, a brittleless slab of concrete masquerading as a medical facility. Tucked away in the irradiated forest north of the Reactor 4 sarcophagus. The rumors in the Stalker camps were specific. This wasn't just a hospital for the liquidators of 86. It was a containment site for something biological that the Soviet brass had been cooking up when the world ended the first time. I checked the seal on my M50 gas mask, tightening the straps until the rubber bit into my scalp. The air here didn't just carry dust, it carried ghosts, and if the intel was right, it carried a viral strain that had been marinating in hard radiation for nearly 40 years. Breaching the main entrance required a pry bar and 20 minutes of sweating inside my hazmat suit. The heavy blast doors groaned, shedding flakes of lead paint like dandruff, before yielding just enough for me to slip through. The interior was a mausoleum of bureaucracy and panic. Patient files were scattered across the linoleum floor, frozen in a layer of grime that looked like black frost. I wasn't here for paper, though. I was here for the loot that everyone else was too afraid to grab: high-grade antivirals, sealed trauma kits, and military-spec filters. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. I moved tactically, weapon raised, a suppressed carbine that felt heavy in my shaking hands. The layout was standard Soviet institutional, long, claustrophobic corridors lined with peeling green paint. But something was wrong with the decay. It wasn't just rot. I knelt by a nurse's station to scavenge. The drawers had been rifled through, likely decades ago, but the looters had missed the lockbox under the desk. A quick work with a tension wrench popped it open. Jackpot. 3 ampoules of epinephrine and a sealed box of potassium iodide tablets. I shoved them into my dumb pouch, my heart rate spiking as I heard a sound from down the hall. It wasn't a moan. Standard infected moan, a wet, guttural rattle. This was different. It sounded like static, a dry, clicking hiss that mimicked the Geiger counter. I froze, killing my light. In the darkness, the hospital came alive with the ambient glow of Cherenkov radiation bleeding through the cracks in the walls. And then I saw them. The evolution. They weren't shamblers. The silhouette at the end of the hall was hunched, its spine extruded through the tattered remnants of a hazardous material suit. The infection here had adapted to the high-sievert environment. The virus wasn't just reanimating dead tissue, it was reinforcing it. I watched, breath held, as the creature moved with a twitchy, insected grace. It wasn't decaying. It was calcifying. The radiation had caused the viral biomass to develop a form of hardened, lead-laced carapace. It turned its head, and where eyes should have been, there were only clusters of bioluminescent tumors, glowing a faint, sick blue. This was the result of the bioweapon mixing with the fallout, a predator that didn't just survive the radiation but fed on it. I backed away slowly, my boots crunching softly on broken glass. The creature's head snapped toward me. It didn't see me, it sensed the isotopes in my gear. The clicking noise intensified, echolocation, or perhaps a signal to others. I retreated toward the stairwell, needing to get to the lower levels where the secure pharmacy was located. The deeper I went, the hotter the radiation became. My dosimeter was screaming now, a constant high-pitched whine that I had to muffle with tape. The basement level was a nightmare of organic overgrowth. The walls were covered in a thick, pulsating webbing that looked like arterial veins made of black mold. This was the hive. The infection had moved beyond individual hosts, and was colonizing the architecture itself. I stepped over a barricade of hospital beds, my flashlight revealing a horrifying tableau: 3 stalkers, missing for weeks, fused into the wall. The biomass had consumed their legs and torsos, keeping their heads free. They weren't dead. Their eyes tracked my light, pupils blown wide, mouths moving in silent pleas. The virus was using them as biological filters, scrubbing the air for nutrients. I raised my carbine and put a single round through the nearest one's forehead. It was a mercy, but it rang the dinner bell. The shriek that tore through the basement shattered the glass of the nearby observation window. It was a multitonal scream, human vocal cords stretched to their limit, layered with the grinding of bone. From the shadows of the sub-level ICU, they poured out. These weren't the calcified ones from upstairs. These were fresh mutations, fast, lean, their skin translucent and weeping plasma. They scrambled over the ceiling pipes, defying gravity, driven by a hypermetabolism fueled by the reactor's poison. I opened fire. The suppressed shots were quiet, but the impacts were wet and visceral. The 56 rounds punched through the translucent flesh, but they didn't go down easy. The virus had rewired their nervous systems. They didn't feel pain, only the biological imperative to spread. I swapped mags, backing into a decontamination shower room. Kicking the heavy doors shut and spinning the wheel lock just as the first body slammed against it. The metal buckled. I was trapped, but I was also where I needed to be. The decontamination room connected to the secure storage. I turned, sweeping the room. There, on a stainless steel rack, was the prize. A hermetically sealed case marked with the biohazard symbol and the code Object 19 Alpha. Experimental jagged edge viral suppressors. The stuff that could halt the turning process if you got bit. I grabbed the case, the weight of it promising a fortune back at the safe zone, or a second chance at life if my seal breached. But the door behind me was giving way. The hinges screamed as the lead-skinned horrors outside battered the steel. I looked for an exit. A ventilation shaft, grate rusted off, high on the wall. I scrambled up a shelving unit, hauling my gear and the heavy case. As I squeezed into the vent, the door blew inward. I looked back and saw the face of the infection's endgame. A massive, distended figure, bloated with pressurized gas and glowing with lethal levels of ionizing radiation. It vomited a stream of corrosive bile that dissolved the steel rack I had just been standing on. I scrambled through the tight metal tunnel, the heat formed the creature radiating against the soles of my boots. The vent deposited me into the morgue, near the rear exit. The air here was colder, the radiation levels dropping slightly. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I burst out of the emergency exit and into the overgrown courtyard, the gray sky of the zone looking like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I sprinted for the tree line, the heavy case banging against my thigh. I could hear them screeching behind me, a chorus of damned souls trapped in a nuclear purgatory. I checked my gear. My suit was torn at the shoulder, a jagged rip from the vent. Panic flared. I stripped the glove off my other hand and touched the skin. No bite. No scratch. Just the red, angry burn of radiation exposure. I popped a handful of the potassium iodide pills I'd scavenged earlier, dry swallowing them as I ran. The hospital faded into the mist behind me, a silent tomb for the living and the dead. I had the cure, or at least the treatment, but I had seen the future of the plague. It wasn't dying out. It was terraforming. The zone was acting as a petri dish, accelerating the evolutionary clock by 1,000,000 years. The zombies weren't just walking corpses anymore. They were the new apex predators of a radioactive ecosystem. As I trekked back toward the cordon, the buzzing of the dosimeter slowed to a click. But the sound of that static hiss, the voice of the new world, echoed in my ears. I knew then that the walls we built wouldn't hold them. Not if they could feed on the very air we poisoned. The Geiger counter on my shoulder clicked a rhythmic, anxiety-inducing tempo, a metronome counting down the seconds until my cells decided to unravel. Object 19. That's what the faded Cyrillic sign said above the reinforced steel doors, barely visible through layers of grime and black mold. It wasn't on any of the tourist maps, and it certainly wasn't in the Stalker handbooks. This was a ghost facility, buried deep within the Red Forest. A place where the Soviet Union had tried to cure radiation sickness and ended up weaponizing biology instead. The heavy pneumatic hiss of the airlock cycling open sounded like the exhale of a dying beast. I adjusted the strap of my respirator, checking the seal for the 10th time. The air inside didn't just smell stale, it smelled like ozone and copper. A metallic tang that bypassed the filters and tasted like blood on the back of my tongue. My tactical light sliced through the gloom of the decontamination chamber. Rows of hazmat suits hung from the ceiling on motorized tracks, swaying slightly in the draft caused by the opening door. They looked like hanged men. I moved low, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet, the suppressed MP5 tight against my shoulder. The floor was slick with a resinous black substance that crunched like dry leaves under my boots. I knelt to examine it. It wasn't rot. It was dried shed skin, layers of it, molted in sheets. The infection out here, in the high rad zones, it wasn't static. It was aggressive. It forced the host to shed and rebuild, over and over again. I pushed into the triage lobby. The devastation was frozen in time, a snapshot of panic from 30 years ago overlaying the fresh horror of the outbreak. Stretchers were overturned, for stands bent like wire. I bypassed the main desk, too exposed, and hugged the wall, scanning for the pharmacy signage. Scavenging in the zone is a discipline of disappointment, but a facility this secure, this untouched? It was a gamble worth dying for. If the rumors were true, Object 19 held experimental radioprotective drugs, synthesized adrenaline, and broad-spectrum antibiotics that hadn't expired in 1996. A noise stopped me. A wet, clicking sound coming from the ceiling vents. I killed my light, plunging the corridor into a suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the faint, sickly green glow of emergency radium strips on the floor. I held my breath. Above me, something heavy dragged itself through the ductwork. The metal groaned. This was the evolution the deep zone runners whispered about. The standard biters, the mindless shamblers, couldn't survive the ionizing radiation of the red forest. Their flesh fell off the bone. But the ones that survived, the virus adapted. It used the radiation as fuel. It calcified their skin into natural armor, fused their bones into jagged weapons. The sound faded toward the east wing. I exhaled slowly and reactivated the light, keeping the beam focused on the floor to minimize scatter. I found the pharmacy door, the glass reinforced with wire mesh. It was locked naturally. I didn't waste time with picks. I pulled a small canister of thermite paste from my rig, painted the hinges, and ignited it. The white-hot flare burned silently, eating through the steel in seconds. I kicked the door in and swept the room. Clear. Jackpot. Dust-covered shelves lined the walls, stocked with amber vials and foil blister packs. I dropped my rucksack and started sweeping, prioritizing the essentials. Morphine ampoules, good for trade. Ciprofloxacin, essential for the inevitable sepsis. Then I saw them, a crate marked with the biohazard symbol and a red cross. Experimental auto-injectors. I grabbed one, reading the label, Regenerative Agent V9. I didn't know what it did, but in the zone, mystery meds were worth more than gold. I loaded the crate into my pack, the weight comforting against my spine. As I turned to leave, I noticed the back wall of the pharmacy wasn't a wall. It had been broken through, revealing a tunnel leading down into the basement levels. The edges of the hole were lined with that same black resin, but here it was wet, pulsing. The biomatter was growing, knitting the concrete together. It looked like the inside of a throat. Curiosity is a fatal flaw in a stalker, but I needed to know what was down there. If this was a nest, I needed to mark it for an airstrike or a burn team. I descended. The temperature rose, the air growing humid and thick. The clicking sound returned, multiplied by a dozen. I switched my optic to thermal. The tunnel lit up like a Christmas tree. Heat signatures were everywhere, embedded in the walls. They weren't just standing there, they were part of the architecture. The infection had evolved past individual hosts. It was building a hive. Bodies were fused together, limbs twisted into structural supports, heads lolling from the biomass, eyes wide and blind. I stepped over a thick cable of muscle running along the floor. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the wall, a human hand, but elongated, the fingers tipped with bone spurs. It grabbed my ankle with hydraulic strength. I didn't scream, I reacted. I stomped down hard, shattering the wrist, the bone crunching like dry kindling. The wall shrieked. It wasn't a single voice. It was a chorus of wails echoing through the flesh tunnel. The hive woke up. From the darkness ahead, a shape detached itself. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its body a patchwork of tumorous muscle and hardened keratin plates. It didn't have a face, just a vertical split in the skull that opened to reveal rows of needle teeth. A juggernaut, the stalkers called them, but this one was different. It glowed. Veins of blue Cherenkov radiation pulsed beneath its translucent skin. It charged. I raised the MP5 and dumped the magazine into its knees. The suppressed shots sounded like polite coughs. The round sparked off its shin plates, doing nothing. It roared, a sound like tearing metal, and backhanded me. I flew backward, slamming into the resin-covered wall. My ribs screamed in protest, and the breath was knocked out of me. I scrambled up, abandoning stealth. I unslung my shotgun, a customized Saiga 12 loaded with slug rounds. The creature lunged. I sidestepped, firing point-blank into its exposed flank. The heavy slug punched through the meat, spraying black ichor and glowing blue fluid. It staggered, thrashing. I didn't wait to see if it fell. I turned and sprinted back up the tunnel, my boots slipping on the slick biomass. The walls were moving now, extrusion-like tendrils reaching for me. I slashed at them with my combat knife, severing grabby fingers and pulsing veins. I burst back into the pharmacy, vaulting the counter. The heavy footsteps of the beast shook the floorboards. It was coming. I fumbled for a fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin, and tossed it down the hole. The explosion was muffled, a dull thump that shook dust from the ceiling, followed by a wet collapse of rubble and flesh. Silence returned, but it was fragile. The clicking had stopped, replaced by a low, angry hum that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I checked my loot. The crate was safe. I checked my Geiger counter. It was maxed out, the needle buried in the red. I had maybe 10 minutes before acute radiation poisoning set in. I limped toward the exit, the adrenaline fading, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the zone. The infection wasn't just spreading, it was terraforming. And we were just nutrients waiting to be harvested.